CBS News special report.
The shooting war could start tomorrow over Cuba.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no?
A speck of optimism, I think. Even that moderate phrase would be too strong for what there is here.
The most dangerous days in the history of the world were 13 days in October 1962. We now know that this stems from an utter failure of understanding, which is foreshadowed in the years of tension that led up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The ultimate misunderstanding, however, lie beyond the crisis.
It became a critical lesson, an analogy, a metaphor for later policymaking.
But they got the lessons completely wrong. All contemporaries accepted that the crisis was resolved through the tools of conflict, that is, strength and toughness. In fact, it was compromised by courageous leaders that averted Armageddon. It is a cliche to say that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, but we must now re-examine the Cuban Missile Crisis and draw the true lessons, or we may continue to repeat the follies that our deafness to history have brought us.
We're on the eve of destruction.
1959, Cuba. Fidel Castro takes over following the Cuban Revolution, and a communist satellite is now 90 miles from America's doorstep. John F. Kennedy is running for President of the United States. He repeatedly speaks of a missile gap, implying USSR nuclear superiority. The truth is, the US enjoys a 17-1 advantage in long-range missiles at this time. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev has risen to power. The West perceives Khrushchev as a temperamental, impulsive arch-communist.
When you are shouting and doing something and you scaring them for death, then you can trade something in what you want to trade.
1961, the U.S. supports a CIA-conceived and sponsored insurrection in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. It fails miserably. Kennedy is humiliated.
The authors of the Bay of Pigs plan had misled him, and he was not going to listen to them anymore.
The USSR is convinced that the U.S. is determined to overthrow Castro and will eventually invade Cuba.
Castro announced, I am joining Soviet bloc. And this changed everything. Now you have to risk everything to defend him. This was most important element of the Bay of Pigs.
Mid-1962, the U.S. ramps up its rhetoric. JFK says, if Cuba should ever become an offensive military base of significant capacity for the Soviet Union, then this country will do whatever must be done. Surveillance and overflights of Cuba are increased. Khrushchev is now prodded by his own military and the relentless Castro.
Show Americans we are serious, and he told we have to place their missiles, and then they will understand that if they will begin this invasion, then we will maybe use them.
I'm sure if we had understood and known each other better, that would have avoided the crisis in the first place.
The Iron Curtain was really like a mirror. It's transparent and you see beyond the curtain. Really, it's only a reflection of your own vision.
The USSR had been repeatedly invaded over the prior 200 years, from Napoleon to Hitler.
Americans were very different. They were protected by two oceans. Khrushchev didn't understand the magnitude of the reaction of the American people.
Khrushchev also miscalculated on secrecy.
He will announce about presence of the missiles after the elections.
This secrecy caused the U.S. to assume that the missiles were not intended for deterrence but to alter the balance of power, the opposite of Khrushchev's intention. The U.S. had their own miscalculations.
It wasn't possible that the Soviets were sending missiles to Cuba because they had never sent nuclear weapons outside of their own territory.
Kennedy had thus felt comfortable with his aggressive rhetoric. However, this led the U.S. into a corner where they would be forced to react strongly. Now, the U.S. discovers what it believes to be incomplete nuclear installations in Cuba via its U-2 surveillance. JFK convenes ExComm, an elite group of senior advisors, to gauge the situation prior to going public.
On the first day, everybody thought that bombing the missiles was the first response most likely to succeed.
Kennedy decides rebuffing hawkish proposals.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The U.S. then challenges the Soviet Union before the world at the United Nations with photographic evidence. To the world, this seemed like the U.S. and the USSR engaging in a deadly staring contest. The U.S. assumes that any aggressive action in Cuba would come directly from Khrushchev, so when a U.S. plane is shot down, XCOM's first reaction is, "This is war." It turns out
Castro told, "I'm tired from the American planes," and he gave the order to his anti-aircraft artillery to shoot these planes.
General Curtis LeMay illegally declares DEFCON 2 on his own, loosening JFK's control over the U.S.'s nuclear arsenal. Soviet subs are armed with nuclear-tipped missiles.
The submarine commander could start the nuclear war.
Castro wrote a letter to Khrushchev urging him to attack the United States with nuclear missiles if the United States attacked Cuba.
If you're receiving such letter, let's start the nuclear war.
You will not sleep well next night.
Kennedy and Khrushchev pursue negotiations through a number of channels: trial balloons, letters, clandestine meetings. The world awakens on Sunday, October 28th, expecting a Holocaust. Instead, we heard this.
I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba.
The U.S. publicly pledged to never invade Cuba. Unknown to the world, however,
Robert Kennedy pledged on his brother's behalf that the missiles in Turkey would be removed within 6 months. That would be null and void if the Soviet Union exposed this secret deal.
after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy could not afford to enter the forthcoming midterm elections, having given in to the Soviets. Therefore, the two leaders agreed to mislead the world into believing that the U.S. had won through conflict, when in fact both leaders saw that no one could win, and that diplomacy and compromise were the only ways out.
In the end, both came to understand that no matter what else was gained, if they drifted into a nuclear war, they had failed.
The world was to pay a great price for its ignorance of the true nature of the Cuban Missile Crisis resolution. Dean Rusk, Kennedy's Secretary of State, proclaimed what became conventional wisdom. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked.
In the American historical mythology, Soviet Union want to change balance of power, so they send missiles to Cuba, and because Khrushchev saw that Kennedy is the weak person, but Kennedy showed him the iron fist. Khrushchev scared, pull his missiles out, and was ousted of power, like Popeye. It's untrue.
The most unfortunate lesson was that military force and nuclear superiority were critical for the United States for the future.
This misguided dogma repeatedly influenced foreign policy with disastrous results.
It contributed to Lyndon Johnson's willingness, or need, if you will, to get involved in Vietnam.
Johnson, although a member of XCOM, was excluded from the key meeting wherein the secret agreement to remove the missiles from Turkey was disclosed. Thus deluded, LBJ attempted to apply Rusk's incorrect premise. Joseph Alsop, an influential columnist, then pressured LBJ, writing, "Vietnam is what the second Cuban crisis was for John F. Kennedy. If Mr. Johnson ducks the challenge, we shall learn by experience about what it would have been like if Kennedy had ducked the challenge in October 1962. Johnson went on to escalate, trapped by Kennedy's secret. The USSR was not immune from the effects of the subterfuge. It lost prestige in the communist world.
A Soviet diplomat said, "You'll never put us in this position again." The USSR went into a huge nuclear weapons building program after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Recently, President George W. Bush sought to justify his new preemptive approach to U.S. foreign policy by setting forth the quarantine as a parallel and successful example of preemption. His press secretary said, "The reason the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved peacefully was because President Kennedy, like President Bush, displayed strength and was indeed willing to use force preemptively." No less an authority than XCOM member and Defense Secretary McNamara reacted with disdain to what he saw as a distortion of history, saying, The quarantine was not preemption, it was the reverse of preemption. The misreading of the crisis as one resolved through conflict rather than compromise continues to misinform, and that matters as we recall what was at stake and what may someday be at stake again.
To end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world.